Hello, lovely people. Today I have Quatermass and the Pit for you guys. It's a 1967 film. 1967. It stars Andrew Keir, Keir. He's Scottish. James Donald, Barbara Shelley, and it was directed by Roy Ward Baker. If this title is not familiar to you, you may actually know it as 5 Million Years to Earth, because that's its alternative title. So yeah, let's get into it. So the plot: under an underground station in London, a pit is opened while they're doing some sort of excavation to put a new train line in. And along with some skeletons, an odd metal object is found, taken to be an unexploded German bomb at first. But it's made of a strange unknown metal and seems to affect people in odd ways. Scientist Bernard Quatermass is called in to identify it and to find out why it's having this effect on people that it comes into contact with. It's kind of loosely the plot anyway. I feel like this plot is this idea is kind of in response to the plague pits that were found sometimes as they were digging new underground lines in London for the trains. So they're actually abandoned underground lines in London as well, and there were fears, and there's still kind of like, you hear stories about this sometimes, about people living in the underground, in the tunnels, since World War II. So basically London was heavily bombed in the war, especially the East End, and the bombing shelters were the underground stations and the tunnels. So some people at the time, obviously it's very scary and it gives you a lot of anxiety, and so some people just stayed in the underground tunnels between raids as well, because they just felt overwhelmed and unsafe. So there was kind of a fear that maybe people would permanently live underground. This didn't happen, but it's kind of an idea that stuck with people, and there's been a couple of films made with kind of this as the starting point. So yeah, but when the tunnels were first being used, trains were they didn't have when you're in a train carriage, it's like an enclosed space. But originally they weren't like that, so you were underground in a tunnel, just in this kind of open air thing, just like rattling through. And yeah, the tunnels weren't tiled at that point. I think maybe they're in the process of doing it, but this is like the really early days of the London Underground. And women who went on the trains were considered to be floozies, I guess. Like, it was kind of a thing that, a lady didn't take the train, you know what I'm saying? So it's just kind of interesting. And when they were making these tunnels, sometimes there's a couple of famous times when they came across plague pits. And yeah, so that would be from 1666, when there was a big plague and bodies were buried in pits. And because those tunnels were unlined, there's some kind of famous stories of bones literally falling into the laps of people taking the trains, falling out of the earth roof and like sort of in somebody's lap, which I think is an amazing story. One of the underground stations, I think it is, I can visually see it, I think it's Bank. Sometimes there's a part of the station that was built through a plague pit, and sometimes people say it's haunted. They get this feeling of fear and this smell that's like a ghostly smell. So these are the kinds of repeated stories or cultural background, I guess, that kind of creates this sense that there's just something about the London Underground. So I think that's kind of my point, is just that that's kind of inspired this idea that there's something underground, and that's where the plot kind of springs from. Quatermass himself is a well-loved character. So he's an aerospace engineer and scientist for the British space program. He's like a classic good guy, and he often comes across things in his line of work that turn out to be sinister forces from outer space. So the character was created for TV in the 1950s by Nigel Kneale, and Quatermass was first on BBC, and then he was on film, like this one, and he was also been in like radio. There's been, you know, books and different things, so he's sort of like quite a well-known sort of famous character. Most recently in 2005 they did a remake of the first the plot that was in the first TV serial. He's actually been played by 7 actors in film, like more specifically in the movies, because that's kind of where we're going. It goes the Quatermass experiment, and that's spelled with an X, so just like X experiment. And that's kind of because films that were X-rated were kind of exciting, so sort of playing with that to get audiences in. But yeah, Quatermass experiment, and then Quatermass 2, that's in 1955 and 1957, and they had Brian Donlevy as the titular character. And then 1967, Andrew Keir comes along for this film. So yeah, these 3 movies are like a remake of the original series, but they had to sort of cut them down a little bit. Yeah, they were kind of made for an more international audience, as opposed to like just British. The serials were on British TV, so these were hoped to reach a wider American audience, which they did. So just a little random fact, which I found out, you know, in the course of this, which I didn't know before. The last name Quatermass was pulled from a phone book. So originally the character was meant to be called Charlton, but it was too sort of everyday, not very exciting for like a scientist. I thought it was a made-up name, but apparently that QU at the start is common to names from the Isle of Man, and that's where the author was from, so he was kind of drawn to that. And yeah, the name comes from a land measurement term from the time of the Norman invasion in 1066, when they invaded and took over everything and like changed, how would you say, like they re-managed the land into different things. I'm not going to go into that because it doesn't really have a bearing on the story. Anyway, Quatermass and the Pit. So this is a Hammer Studios film. If that rings a bell, they're most famous for monster films made from the 50s to the 70s in color. So Dracula with Christopher Lee is kind of one that springs to mind for me really strongly, but they did a bunch of like Mummy and Frankenstein movies and stuff like that as well. They kind of went dark for a bit. They had some problems reaching audiences and stuff, but they revamped in 2007, so they're back making horror. Let Me In 2010, Woman in Black 2012, that kind of stuff. Anyway, this movie has a similar kind of aesthetic maybe to the other films, like the other monster films I mentioned. By that I mean kind of with the set and the acting style, even though this is more sort of one, there's more than one place, but it's a fairly like closed environment in some ways. They're mostly on the underground, and they go to a couple of other places. But with this film, what kind of drew me to sharing it with you guys is that it's kind of well into the 60s. And so the film has some little interesting sequences that are a bit kind of psychedelic and colorful and sort of stylish in a kind of very much of their era kind of a way. Okay, so the film is a three-hander in my mind. Though there's a few interesting kind of side characters scattered throughout the narrative who are also really good. But there's Quatermass with his like beard and hat. He's the good guy. He's like warning the army that they may be dealing with something more than the ordinary, and he uses his knowledge and experience to kind of fight the evil in this film. Andrew Keir's Quatermass was really got a lot of good reviews or whatever for his more natural performance than Dunleavy. Quatermass is, I think, from Andrew Keir is, I think, from Scotland, and the other Dunleavy is an American to sort of reach the American market. And like, he's dapper and stuff, but he's sort of miscast. He doesn't quite get the more British subtlety of the character. So not a criticism, those films are actually really good, but that was kind of what was felt about this film. Keir himself felt that the director hadn't wanted him for the role, and he felt like the director didn't like him, and he was like super uncomfortable on the set. But you actually, like, I wouldn't have known that from his performance, so I think he's really good. He's joined by James Donald, who plays a paleontologist who's called in after the first skull is found, and who identifies it as being ape-like and the oldest ever found in paleontology at 5 million years. So you might recognize him. He's been in a lot of good stuff. The two that kind of come to mind for me with him is Bridge on the River Kwai and The Great Escape. He has like this lovely expressive face, and he plays really well against Keir. I found him really likable and watchable. So his character calls in the military to investigate the metal object because they think it's a bomb, so they're looking for a bomb squad, which means a guy called Colonel Breen comes in. He's played by Julian Glover, and Quatermass kind of comes along with him, like in tow. They don't like each other, the two characters. Colonel Breen is like Julian Glover, I should say, is a super versatile actor. So if you are a Harry Potter fan, you might recognize his voice because he is the voice of Aragog in Chamber of Secrets. He's also General Veers in Empire Strikes Back. He's in one of the Indiana Jones films as well. So he's had like some really interesting roles. He's kind of the opposing side to Quatermass. He's like science, but as like militarization, science as a weapon, as opposed to Quatermass being more a means of finding peaceful solutions, understanding answers, that kind of thing. So where Quatermass is reason, Breen is force. He's also kind of like annoying and arrogant, so it's kind of satisfying when you see his downfall, because you're like, why would you just listen to Quatermass? Anyway, Barbara Shelley plays a character called Barbara Judd. So she's the beautifully dressed and smart assistant paleontologist. I kind of like her because she kind of makes me laugh. She's the token female of the film. And she's sort of smart, but not so smart that the scientific men in the room are intimidated or whatever. But she's cool. She teams up with Quatermass as he investigates. The actress Barbara Shelley is interesting. She spent some time she did a Hammer film, and then she went to Italy and she made like a little bunch of films at the start of her career there in Italy. So she spoke like fluent Italian. And then she came back and did some other horror, but she worked on quite a few for Hammer, and she became known as like the queen of Hammer horror movies, the studio. So she's appealing because she has like this kind of the feminine, beautiful look that was sought after for horror leads at the time. But she's not like silly or a bimbo, or like, she has a kind of gravitas which comes across and really adds something to the films that she's in, which is why she was so popular, because she kind of, I don't know, she's really cool. In this film, she is a little bit more emotional than the boys, a little bit more fragile maybe, but she's pretty brave because she has like a kind of more sensitive nature, I guess, is kind of what they're trying to portray. She's able to help them understand the object because she's able to do this sort of, they have this machine that taps into your subconscious, and she's able to help them find out what the object is and what its intentions is and stuff like that. And because of the way it makes people go crazy who come in contact with it, and like different things happen to different people, she's pretty brave to do that. So she's pretty tough. More than just a pretty face. So early on in the film, Roni, the paleontologist, and Quatermass discover that the metal object they thought was a bomb is actually something from space that crash landed 5 million years ago. And the skulls that they find are early precursors to humans, so humanity as we know it may have been kind of kickstarted by the influence of this object. So that's kind of their thing, but the tension and fear is ratcheted up by these local stories that they hear of the area being haunted by the devil. Or there's one house specifically that has had frequent stories of hauntings and stuff. There's rumors that the devil's been seen in the area. Quatermass is all about science over superstition, so he's like, gotta go to the haunted house. So meanwhile, whilst they're kind of off, sometimes like kind of investigating or whatever, the military is under Colonel Breen is hard at work trying to open the metal object by force, with Breen being sure that he either has his hands on some kind of weapon, or he has this conspiracy theory that the Nazis are trying to frighten the Londoners and create chaos or something. So he's just kind of ignoring Quatermass. But it does open up its own volition, and insect-like creatures, corpses, are found inside. And then apparitions start to appear, and people who come into contact with the machine, as I mentioned, like have different things happen. But it starts to escalate because as they're approaching the machine, and then, you know, getting closer and closer to the center of the machine. Some of them develop some psychokinetic abilities and stuff. So kind of gets a bit crazy. It's pretty cool. So the film, I have to say, like, it is a little dinky by modern standards, which you would expect. It's from the 60s. Dinky never bothers me personally. And watching it is a little bit quaint. Like, it is kind of old-fashioned, and some of the early scenes maybe a little slow by modern expectations, maybe. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't also entertain and create tension. I kind of like the way it mixes science fiction with like old English ghost story tropes. So like there's a scene where somebody walks through a wall, like a ghost, and there's talk of like devils in the neighborhood and like a sort of haunted house scene and stuff like that. So it kind of is like playing on that, but suggesting that there's like a scientific explanation for things like that, which is kind of cool, right? So there's this sense of science being a force of reason against superstition. But then, like, when you investigate, there's something even worse than imagined, and even bigger and scarier and more evil underneath the superstition. I don't know. I feel like that's definitely something that I can imagine if I saw this when I was a kid, or if I had been around in the 60s or whatever. I think this film would have really stayed with me, and I would have been like, so what if aliens did influence human life? You know what I mean? It's kind of, it raises some interesting questions, and I think it's one of those interesting science fiction films that kind of looks at the way science can be helpful, or, you know, something that can be a good thing can also be harnessed to be a bad thing. There's a pretty good set piece at the end. I'm trying not to like spoil it and give you all of the sort of takeaways or whatever, or the little moments, but there's a really good piece at the end where things are escalating, and it's kind of intense. There's lots of like people falling over and shouting and running around and stuff. It's cool. And the central characters, the three that I kind of focused on, are really watchable. So yeah, poses some interesting thoughts about the nature of evil and humanity, and science weaponized versus as a means of discovery or improving life. Yeah, and the final scene at the end, it closes, and this isn't, I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end, but it closes on Quatermass and Judd, just the credits rolling as they sit, like, catching their breath amongst, like, a bunch of devastation. And yeah, that feels very different than like a superhero triumphant ending, or, you know, like a sitcom ending on a laugh. Like, it just feels very different, which is cool. So yeah, I think it's a fun little era to visit, the 60s in films. A little bit of this sort of psychedelia making its way into films like this, and plenty of sort of the holdover of that kind of hysterical kind of acting where there's lots of emotions and emphatic talking, and you know who the bad guy is and who the good guy is, and that's good fun. And there's a 60s kind of look and style to the whole thing, obviously, as well, which is cool. So this film is kind of a fan favorite, and it still has a pretty strong following to this day, and is still, people, you know, still recommended viewing and stuff like that. So yeah, that is Quatermass in the Pit from 1967. It is online. You should be able to find it somewhere. I'm not sure who has it, but it's out there. And thank you for joining me for this one. It feels like it's been a little bit of a long one, which is fun. Yeah, so feel free to like and subscribe. I know you guys are lovely, and sometimes leave me a comment, which I don't always see, so don't be mad if I don't reply. I do appreciate it, and sometimes I see them like later that I feel bad. But I appreciate it, and yeah, I have some fun ones to share with you coming up as well, so I'm kind of excited about that. Thanks for watching.